Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm Paul Rose. I'm the dean here. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Law Review Symposium. We are grateful to have such a distinguished group of speakers. We're grateful for the students and the faculty and others that are gathered here today. Before we dive into our discussions, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some key contributors to this event today. Of course, these events, for those of you that have been involved in them, know that it's really months of planning and effort. We are grateful for the dedication and the hard work of the executive board of the Law Review, for the thoughtful leadership of Professor Betsy Rosenblatt, and we're grateful for Eric Seiler. Eric, raise your hand so folks can see you. Eric's coordination makes so many events here at the law school possible, and of course he's a big reason for this coming together so successfully today. And of course we're grateful for our speakers joining us here. We're grateful for your willingness to share your insights, and I'm sure it's going to be a very fruitful discussion. Now to the heart of today's topic, defending tomorrow's democracy, the future of elections in the era of advanced technology. We know that law review symposia like this are not just academic exercises. They're really a platform where we can think about solutions, where we can think about these kind of critical real-world issues and how we can tackle them in a way that hopefully will benefit not just the legal community but society at large. So as we approach the 2024 election, of course, we find ourselves in a rapidly evolving technological landscape. I make use of that rapidly evolving technological landscape all the time, using ChatGPT and Claude for various things. But of course, those technologies also pose unprecedented challenges to our democratic processes. We're seeing AI-generated deepfakes of presidential candidates, automated misinformation campaigns, voter suppression through technology, and the implications are staggering. How do we safeguard the integrity of our elections in this new era, an era where technology can both enhance but also undermine the democratic process? So this symposium aims to address those urgent questions, and I'm eager to hear the ideas and thoughts and solutions that will emerge from our discussions today. So with that in mind, it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Professor Geronimo, who is going to talk to us about our sponsors for today's symposium.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Dean Rose, and thanks especially to these law review editors who put in so much work to arrange this great panel of speakers on cutting-edge scholars on what really couldn't be a more timely issue as we lead up to this election. As Dean Rose mentioned, I'm Andy Geronimo. I'm the director of the First Amendment Clinic here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. And we'd like to expend special thanks to the Stanton Foundation for financial support for this foundation. The Stanton Foundation is the legacy of Frank Stanton, born 1908 and died in 2006, a former CBS executive who's well known, among other things, for navigating the legal hurdles leading up to the Nixon-Kennedy presidential debate in 1960. The Stanton Foundation's philanthropic efforts include support for initiatives, including our clinic, where I'm helped by our amazing fellows, Sarah Coulter and Siobhan Gerber, who are over here, and events like this that attempt to advance important conversations on First Amendment issues, about an engaged and informed citizenry. As you'll hear today, the law has in many ways struggled to keep up with how technology really tries to balance the tension between speech and privacy. And certainly a presidential debate in 2024 presents certain challenges for the law that it didn't in 1960. While my colleagues and students in the First Amendment Clinic are fighting these battles, quote unquote, in the trenches and representing clients in the courts of Ohio, we also think it's very important to have these conversations outside of the context of adversarial litigation, so we can address the the normative challenges that come along with these things. So with that, once again, thank you so much to the law review editors, and a special thank you to the Stanton Foundation for their financial support. And with that, I'll introduce Professor Betsy Rosenblatt.
Thank you. I want to share gratitude to the First Amendment Clinic and the Stanton Foundation, who, when we said we were interested in doing a discussion about the future of democracy and technology, said, "Oh, we'll pay for that." And so it was really, it was really miraculous. And thank you so much, not only to you, but also to the clinic program in general, and Laura McNally, who has been a fantastic leader of experiential education and the clinic program in general. I want to recognize that my predecessor, Jonathan Enton, is here and has been an inspiration to me in leading the law review. I've done lots of symposiums over my time, and I have to say that the symposium format that we have here is smooth and wonderful, partly because Eric Seiler behind the scenes works so well, and partly because of just how student-led the whole symposium process is. Andrew McGurty came up with this topic, found the speakers. I mean, he had help. But this has been his show all the way, and he's been a tremendous organizer, both in terms of the logistics of putting on an event like this, but also in terms of really thinking about all the angles that might come up from a doctrinal and normative standpoint, or what we should be thinking about and who we should be talking to on these subjects. And so I want to thank him, and I really, really want to thank our speakers, both here and on screen, for what I hope will be a really engaging discussion of problems that I think are not new. The problems of what we can believe, who we can trust, how we can depend on our information sources, what it means to defame somebody, what the very nature of truth is. These are not new questions, but they're questions that have become easier to obscure the answers to in our recent times, as technology has made everything fuzzier. The concept of fake news is not a new one. The fact that we have to deal with fake news every day is. And so I think this conversation is timely and important, and I'm really excited to have it. So thank you all for coming. The room will fill up more as the late sleepers arrive, and I look forward to that too. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rosenblatt, for that gracious welcome. I think everybody probably already knows me. I'm Andrew McGurty. I'm the executive symposium editor for the Law Review this year. And yeah, I think it's been talked about a little bit thus far. This event really reflects, I think, about 7 months of planning and preparation. And as much as Professor Rosenblatt made it seem like it was all me, that's not the case. I would love to say my interest and area of planning to practice is in election law. It's not. And so I really leaned on a lot of different professors at the law school to guide me in the area of this, to find speakers, to find topics that would are ripe to talk about in the legal field. So a few to name: Professor Jonathan Adler, Professor Koo, who will be a moderator on the panel, Professor Ellis, Professor Rosenblatt helped a lot, and they really just guided me. One, like, what does a symposium look like? What kinds of discussions happen? And then who? So we kind of have the A-team here. Actually, nobody declined to present at this symposium. So I'm really gracious for that, and made my job a lot easier. On top of that, I also want to thank a lot of the Law Review exec board, in particular Bobby Reed and Izzy back there doing the social media. They really helped with putting together all of the promotion for this event and overall just being a good ear to listen to my jibber jabber about all of the different ideas I have for putting this together. And then welcome everyone for coming. I think this has fallen off, but yeah, it's amazing to see so many different faces and everyone from the Law Review here and other students. I'm sure it'll fill up. There's a lot of different classes going on. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody coming and being able to listen to this. And this will be recorded, so if you ever want to come back and watch it or push it out to anyone else to watch, it will be recorded and put on the website afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first panel. If you're on the first panel, feel free to come up and take your seats. So this first panel has a lot of different discussions. I think the title is just Advanced Technology and Election Law Topics. Each of them will present on very different topics of law and will really delve into each of their areas of expertise. I really left the topics for all of the speakers wide open. As I said, I'm not an expert in this, all of them are. So you'll be able to hear from all of them and what they in particular have spent their whole career working towards and now know exactly what's important to talk about right in this moment. So I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Rebecca Green from Williams & Mary Law School. She is the Associate Professor of Law there, where she teaches election law, legislative redistricting, and privacy law, among other courses. Professor Green's research interests focus on the intersection of privacy law and elections. Most recently, her scholarship centers on election observation, election surveillance, and redistricting transparency. She also writes about election administration topics, including the role of partisanship in election administration and election dispute resolution. Professor Green is the co-director of the William & Mary Election Law Program, a joint project of the law school and the National Center for State Courts that provides resources for judges on election law topics. In 2013, Professor Green co-founded Revive My Vote to assist Virginians with prior felony convictions regain the right to vote, and in 2018, she joined the National Task Force on Election Crises, a cross-partisan group convened to prevent and mitigate a range of election crises. She has a BA in Political Science from Connecticut College, a master's in Chinese legal history, which is very interesting, from Harvard University, and a JD from Harvard Law School. Without further ado, Professor Green.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and to the Law Review for inviting us. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Make a little turn up.
I don't know if I can, actually. Scooch forward. Is this thing on? Can you hear me? Is everybody? Yeah, is that better? Okay, good. I'm going to scoot forward. Okay. PowerPoint. Excellent. Okay, so in 2019, I wrote a paper called Counterfeit Campaign Speech, and it was about deep fakes. And I looked at the particular threat that a technology posed that could effectively make it seem like people were saying and doing things that they were not, in fact, saying or doing. And I looked at the particular harms that could, unleash on our election system. So I first argued or described how deepfakes could threaten to harm voters by altering source material and making it impossible for voters to determine what is true and what is not true, which would, of course, irretrievably distort and sort of harm our political discourse. Then I looked also at the unique harms that deepfakes would pose for candidates. So I worried that deepfakes would rob political candidates of their dignity and control over their persona. And then I also worried about whether deepfakes would make it harder or more unlikely that good people would run for office, in a world where your dignity could be so easily robbed. And the article was a bit of a downer, to be honest. It cheery topic. And indeed, the general topic of technology and democracy tends towards doomsday scenarios, and I think we'll probably be hearing a lot about those today. But today I thought I would try to be a little more optimistic. So I'm thrilled to start off what I'm assuming will be a day that will make you nervous about democratic functioning. I thought I would start off with some sun. So I'm planning on laying out several ways that AI tools can make our democracy potentially stronger. So the first one I thought I'd call your attention to is the use of AI in campaigning. And I have this slide of this amazing woman who ran for U.S. Congress in Pennsylvania's 10th district. Her name is Charmaine Daniels, and she used AI as a virtual campaign volunteer to do voter outreach. And this technology was created by a technology startup called Civox. And what the technology did was it answered questions about Daniels' positions, about her policy positions and those of her opponent to people, voters who interacted with the tool. The bot was trained on factual information so that when it was speaking about her policy positions, it was always reflecting her actual positions. Importantly, she didn't make it sound exactly like her voice. It had a metallic sound to it so that the listener was clear that they were not listening to a human voice, so it wasn't trying to trick anybody. But what's amazing about it is, if you think about the possibilities here, this tool could be translated in 20 different languages so that it could interact with voters in all kinds of different languages, which has for voter outreach and who you can actually reach. It also was much more accurate because if you think about it, you can train a volunteer on what your positions are, but when they're standing in front of a voter, they may not have a full picture of the range of your views. Whereas this bot, was really able to share what her positions were and what those of her opponents were, in her opinion. It was a really amazing tool. I don't want to oversell it. There was some reporting that there were some hallucinations happening in the bot's answers, especially if you ask the bot an off-topic question. So, for example, if you happen to ask the bot what Charmaine Daniels thought about Cheetos, it responded that they were known for being delicious, which of course is true, but it also said that they were health conscious, which is not. So I think this technology holds a lot of promise, particularly where you have candidates that may not have as many volunteers to do outreach. You can imagine how much how this lowers barriers to candidates entering into the political sphere. It goes without saying that AI can also help candidates with fundraising. I know that we all hate robocalls and solicitations for donations, but it actually is the case that campaigns need money to happen. And AI tools are helping candidates raise more money with less. So there's a company called Sterling Data, just putting their webpage up here, and it uses AI to assist candidates with donor outreach. It's apparently helped thousands of candidates, including Senator John Fetterman, identify potential donors, and it's able to do so cutting its prices nearly in half due to the speed with that AI can be used to sort through donor files. So it essentially makes these tools available to less funded campaigns in important ways. Apparently, when you read the reporting about this tool, campaigns are pretty skittish about it. They'll often say that they will only work with a vendor if the vendor can promise that the public will never find out that they're using AI tools, because I think people still think of them as creepy. And yet, these tools may prove hugely beneficial for crowd campaigns looking to raise revenue to spread their messages. And so I think these tools, these AI tools, hold tremendous promise for informing voters about candidates and helping lower barriers for would-be candidates. This improves the accessibility of running for office, which is, I think, a dramatically underappreciated need. You need to have a lot of courage to run for office, and whatever we can do to help good people, get in the race, I think is good. For fun, I thought we could stretch our imagination a little bit further than AI tools helping real candidates run for office. and sort of wonder whether AI might itself run for office. And there's this great example out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, of this guy. His name is Victor Miller. He's a librarian, and he had a very unique mayoral campaign. He pledged to run for city government, and when he won, he would just deploy AI to make every decision for his office. So his AI bot is called VIC, which stands for Virtually Integrated Citizen. And he argued that AI would be objective, it wouldn't make mistakes, it would read hundreds of pages of municipal minutiae quickly and understand them, and he suggested that VIC could be really good for democracy in Cheyenne. At a campaign event that he held at the library, he set up an iPad at a lectern, and he allowed his, the audience members, the voters, to ask questions, just like you would ask essentially a ChatGPT. And they asked questions like, is the computer system in City Hall sufficient to handle AI? One person asked, if elected, would you take a pay cut? Another asked, how would you make your decisions that would affect so many people? And in the article that's linked on this slide, the reporter described Vic's responses as replying in a male-sounding voice, saying things like, here's how I would approach it, and then the AI bot would tick off a 6-part plan that included using AI to gather data on public opinion and responding to constituents at town halls. So giving sort of reassurance that it would be based on feedback from the public. You may be skeptical that we're ready to trust an AI mayor, but the reality is that these tools might become central to governing, and probably already are starting to become central to how our democracy is governed, ways that we're only sort of starting to imagine. So I thought I would shift a little from talking about AI and campaigning to talking just a little bit about AI in election administration. I'm not sure how much you all are aware of this. It's certainly in the headlines a lot, but election administrators in this country are under huge pressure. Public distrust in elections has skyrocketed, and that has translated directly into threats and harassment and just sort of overall pressure on election administration. Their election administrators are under a microscope. They're barraged with threats, including physical threats, and their work is constantly questioned. And so one question is whether or not AI can be used to help reduce some of this pressure. And I think it's already happening. So I was talking to this woman named Lindsay Wilson, who runs an election nonprofit, or it's not an elections. She runs the elections part of a nonprofit that's called U.S. Digital Response. This is their website. This is what they do on the elections side. So this is a team of 9,000 vetted volunteer coders who are mobilized to help solve municipal problems using AI. They take on projects for local governments, and they have elections as one of their specialties. They use, essentially they help jurisdictions, municipalities identify areas where they could use AI to smooth their operations. And she told me about one of the projects that they have in the works, which is using AI to do ballot proofing, meaning making sure that your ballot lists the candidates correctly and the democracy initiatives correctly, which is actually quite a difficult job. So I'm sure you all remember, some of you were alive, some of you were not alive, but the Bush v. Gore debacle arose because of just poor ballot layout. But in every election, there are mistakes on ballots that have real consequences because either the voters aren't being given the correct ballot, and so their votes are essentially voided, or when there's a real problem, it can cost thousands of dollars if it's caught in advance to fix the ballot, and it can additionally erode public trust in election outcomes when there have been these kinds of mistakes. So deploying AI tools to proof ballots is actually a really incredible benefit for election administrators. And lest you think it's sort of looking over a ballot and making sure that it's correct, you have to understand that many jurisdictions have thousands of different ballot formats because of different races and different jurisdictions and different measures going before different voters. So it's actually quite complicated. Lindsay told me about one jurisdiction that had 5,000 versions of their ballots, more than 5,000 versions of their ballots. So you can imagine how using these AI tools could really reduce human error and improve election quality. I thought I'd also quickly mention ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center. You may have heard of it. It's been in the news because a lot of Republican states have pulled out of ERIC. It's a system that uses very sophisticated and vetted tools to help states figure out how to maintain their voter rolls by using data from other states to determine whether people have moved. I always ask my election students this question: when you move to a new state, did you make sure to call up your old state and tell them that you had moved the election office, so that they would take you off the voter rolls? Answer is always no. Like, nobody thinks to call their election office and tell them to take that they moved. So the states rely on data from the Postal Service, from the DMVs, from death records and other data. And so the best way to sort of fix our voter rolls and make them more accurate is to have a very robust system like ERIC to cross-check voter registration databases. But the problem is that conspiracy theories and other misinformation led a lot of people to think that the ERIC system was corrupted and benefited the Democratic Party, and as a result, a lot of states pulled out. The sad news there is that obviously with fewer states, it's less accurate. So it was a real disappointment to the many very smart people who had created ERIC as really the most robust system to do this work. It essentially it uses AI by allowing election administrators to search for duplicate entries across many different data sets, and it has a ton of privacy and other protections built in, including that it conducts human review before anything it goes forward, or in terms of states being notified of duplicates. So if you care about reliable tools that allow election administrators to identify ineligible voters on voting lists, you should be thrilled with ERIC, and you should know that it carefully deploys AI tools to do the job, and is a great example of how AI can be leveraged to improve election administration. I've got a bunch of these, and I don't even have any sense of my timing here. How am I doing? 5 minutes. Okay, great. Another example is signature matching. So when you vote absentee, you often, you always sign your name, and states have various degrees of sophistication in terms of how they match your signature to make sure that you are who you say you are. And some states use AI in this process in incredibly effective ways. So in Colorado, they've been voting by all mail for years. They're one of the most sophisticated systems in the country, and they have a system that collects your signature at various points when you interact with the government. So they have lots and lots of examples of your signature, unlike some states who will just use your signature when you register to vote, and that can obviously change over the course of several years and become more difficult. But anyway, Colorado has this very sophisticated system that uses AI to verify signatures in a really robust way and make sure that people whose signatures have changed over time, it doesn't flag their ballot. And obviously, in systems that use AI effectively to verify signatures, you get quicker results, which tends to enhance public trust in election outcomes, which is a really important service. There are lots of election administrators that are deploying chatbots to help voters, doing things like answering basic voter questions or providing information about polling locations or voting hours. These bots are also helping election administrators make sure that election materials are accurately translated, and can even help election officials analyze post-election data to identify, for example, common reasons that absentee ballots are rejected. Yes, sir?
If you would move your mic a little closer to
your
your
mouth.
mouth.
I feel like I'm on top of my mic.
Only when you turn your head.
Oh, okay. I'll try to hold I'm almost done. So in any event, there are lots of ways that election administrators can deploy AI tools to help voters and the process, go better. I can't end these comments without talking about some of the downsides of using AI for election administration and even for campaigning. I'll just mention a Center for Democracy and Technology report that really raised a lot of important questions about the use of AI in elections. So they analyzed campaign chatbots intended to help voters with disabilities, which found that 61% of the responses had at least one type of insufficiency. So it was everything from very small problems like broken web links to outside resources to big problems like misinformation, including incorrect voter registration deadlines and falsely stating that election officials are required to provide curbside voting. And then 100% of these tools hallucinated at least once, the tools that they looked at, providing inaccurate information that was entirely constructed by the model, such as describing a law or a voting machine and a disability rights organization that did not exist. So I think it's becoming clearer and clearer, at least to me, that AI tools only work when human review is part of the process. So I think that they have to be deployed really carefully. Ooh, is it gone altogether? No, good. Another thing to mention, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about this today, is the problem of algorithmic discrimination. If you look at errors, for example, in voter list maintenance, they often tend to target Hispanic, Black, and Asian voters more, given they're more than twice as likely to be inaccurately flagged. In addition, young and first-time mail-in voters, elderly voters, and voters with disabilities often confront algorithmic discrimination. So that is a real problem. And please don't confuse my attempt to demonstrate the benefits of AI to democracy as any indication that there aren't serious concerns to be addressed. And then in the 1 minute I have left, I thought I would just quickly mention the overlay of state law on this question. So as AI tools are developing, state laws are starting to proliferate that address the use of AI in commercial settings that could impact its use in election settings. And also lots of states have laws now that are specific to the use of AI in elections. And so, for example, Colorado has a law which doesn't take effect until 2026 that requires a deployer of a high-risk system to use reasonable care to protect consumers from any known or reasonably foreseeable risks of algorithmic discrimination in the high-risk system. So you can imagine that could have implications for use of AI, as I've described in campaigning and election administration. You can also look at the 19 states that have enacted laws targeting the use of deep fakes specifically and synthetic media in election campaigns. This, of course, could impact the uses of AI in campaigning that I've described. Though most of those laws require disclosure, and then you're off the hook. So if Charmaine Daniels would be okay because she made it very clear that the bot was not in fact her. In any event, I think in the next several years, as these dynamics unfold, I hope that you'll at least keep room in your heart for the possibility that AI could actually help our democracy improve. I think despite all fears that AI tools can invoke, there's real promise that they can be leveraged to improve U.S. democracy. I'll stop there.
Good morning. My name's Atiba Ellis. I'm a professor here at Case Western. I want to join the welcomes first of all. And second of all, before we return to my friends here on the panel, I want to point out that in my 18 years of teaching in law schools, this is the first time that I've seen a symposium 15 minutes ahead in its schedule. So I apologize for sort of jumping in at this point rather than when I had hoped to. But let me take the role of moderator back and introduce my friend, Professor Char Torres-Spelcy, who is a professor of law at the Stetson University College of Law. She teaches courses in election law, the First Amendment, corporate governance, business entities, and constitutional law. She's an expert in particular in campaign finance law, and she's presented on this topic at symposia across the United States and abroad. She's testified before Congress. She has testified before state and local legislative entities, and she has led a charge, I would say, on campaign finance reform. Indeed, she's addressed the Federal Election Commission on dark money and foreign money in U.S. elections. She's the editor of the 2010 edition of the Brennan Center for Justice's Campaign Finance Treatise, Writing Reform, a guide to drafting state and local campaign finance laws. Prior to joining Stetson, Professor Torres Spelsey was counsel at the democracy program of the Brennan Center at NYU Law, where she provided guidance on issues of money in politics and the judiciary, and this guidance was directed at state and federal lawmakers. She has a BA from Harvard University and a JD from Columbia. Professor Torres Spelsey.
Alrighty. Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning. Good morning. Alrighty. There we go. All right. So part of this talk is a preview of my forthcoming book, Corporatocracy, and the nutshell version is this is Citizens United meets January 6th. You know, cheery topics. And so today I'm going to ask the question, does the blockchain block democracy? So sometimes reporters will ask me, what is the worst money in politics story you've ever heard? And so I'm about to tell you the worst money in politics story I have ever heard. It starts with a political party. And our political party, when the curtain opens, is broke. And they are so broke, they're so in the red, that they're worried that they might have to disband the entire enterprise. So what do you do if you're a political party and you have no money? Especially in a context where there are no contribution limits and you can give dark money. Well, one approach is ask the richest people in your society for money. And that is exactly what this political party does. They have a secret meeting at one of the political party leaders' houses. Another leader starts making a speech with some really problematic statements in it. He says, private enterprise cannot be maintained in the age of democracy. He continues, we must first gain complete power if we want to crush the other side completely. And then I think most ominously he says, now we stand before the last election. If the election does not decide that we are in power, the decision must be brought about by other means. And so our leaders of industry listen to this anti-democratic screed and they fork over millions in dark money. And suddenly our political party, which had been broke, goes from being in the red to being in the black. And it was the last free election for over a decade. This is a true story. Here are some of the men involved. So we have Alfred Krupp and his father Gustav Krupp. They were the head of the Krupp Corporation. Then there was Frederick Flick. He was the head of the Flick concern. Then there was Carl Crouch, who was the head of IG Farben. Now, if you've never heard of IG Farben, you might know one of its surviving subsidiaries called Bayer. Farben was a chemical company, and it made everything from Bayer aspirin to Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the gas chambers. So if you haven't figured this out yet, I'm talking about the Nazi Party in 1933. The problematic quotes are from Hitler. And at the time, the average German citizen did not know that these corporations were giving to this political party. And that is the problem with dark money. No one from the outside knows what the insiders know. Now, these particular industrialists were so awful during World War II. They used slave labor that was provided to them by the Nazis, so they actually get tried at Nuremberg. So this is an image from the Krupp Tribunal, this is an image from the Farben Tribunal, and this is an image from the Flick Tribunal. And because they were tried by Americans, all of these transcripts and evidence is in English, which is perfect for a writer like me, because I don't speak German. But what you can see in the evidence in these tribunals is that it really was corporate money going to the Nazis because they kept meticulous records. So you can see the bank transfers from Corporation X into the Nazi accounts. Now, all of that is almost 100 years ago and thousands of miles away. Let's think about our own political context. And I want to be really clear, I'm not trying to equate any modern American party with the Nazis. But I think we can learn from the story of the Nazi Party in 1933. We can think about what does it mean when power and greed intersect in really pernicious ways. So let's look at our last election. So our last election was the midterm. And on the screen, you see all of the top political spenders on the record in the federal election. And I have a little asterisk by Sam Bankman-Fried's name. And I have a little asterisk next to the $38 million figure, which is next to his name, which is his on-the-record spending in that election. And the reason why I think that figure is not accurate is he was indicted. And there are two ways that a scholar like me can see dark money. It comes out in leaks or litigation. And in Sam Bankman-Fried's case, we have both. So the litigation is his prosecution, and then I'll tell you about the leak in a moment. So he's indicted for securities fraud, and he is also accused of campaign finance crimes. But it's a little unclear in his first indictment, like, what are you actually accusing him of? But there's a superseding indictment, which is way more clear. And in that superseding indictment, DOJ accuses Sam Bankman-Fried of making $100 million in illegal corporate contributions. It's illegal because of an old law called the Tillman Act from 1907, which still bars, to this day, corporations from using their treasury funds to give money directly to federal candidates. And that is what he stands accused of. Now, why is he doing this? Like, only Sam Bankman-Fried really knows for sure. His prosecutors surmise that he was trying to curry favor with elected officials in Washington, and that he was trying to get legislation that would benefit his companies, FTX and Alameda. And before he was indicted, he was making the rounds of Capitol Hill. He had a model piece of legislation that he was pushing. Now, how did Sam Bankman-Fried get away with this, at least for a couple of years? I think here we have the leak, and the leak is from him. So while he's under indictment, he starts talking to the press. So all you future lawyers sitting in here, if you ever have a client who is indicted, tell them to shut up. I'm sure his lawyers told him to shut up, but he didn't shut up. So instead, he gives interviews, and in some of the interviews, he clarifies that that 38 million figure you saw, that was all for Democrats, and that was all on the record. But he gave more to Republicans, and he gave it dark. And I think part of why he might have gotten away with this for a little while is it's hard to figure out what's happening with dark money. And some of you know how this story ends. Sam Bankman-Fried is now a guest of the state. He got 25 years for his securities fraud, but not for his campaign finance crimes. The reason he didn't get prosecuted for his campaign finance crimes is when he was being extradited from the Bahamas, someone left the words campaign finance off of those papers. And so his very good criminal defense lawyer said, you can't try him for this, you didn't extradite him for that. And for a little while, DOJ actually was fighting with his defense counsel over this, but DOJ dropped it once they got the 25-year conviction. True story. Okay, so what is the nightmare scenario? How do these very different narratives intersect in my mind? Well, we obviously have an audience for anti-democratic ideas as evidenced by the violence on January 6th. But I think we got lucky because there was relatively little corporate sponsorship of that event. But what really sort of keeps me up at night is what happens when the next Sam Bankman-Fried, the next billionaire, decides to team up with anti-democratic politicians. Like, what is it going to look like if you have an anti-democratic politician who has major corporate sponsorship, especially if they are spending in a dark way? And just to clarify, this is how dark money becomes dark. You have a corporation, or you could have a rich individual who doesn't want to spend under their real name. So they will give money to a dark entity. That dark entity is usually a LLC, a 501c4, which is a social welfare organization, or a 501c6, which is a trade association. And once it goes to that dark entity, and spending goes, in favor of this generic candidate I have here, the public cannot see back through the chain. They can't tell the actual source of that funding. And we already have 162 million in dark money in this election. And that is only the money that was spent in 2023 for this election. We won't know how much dark money is in the 2024 election until months after it's over. This is worrisome because it could hide anything from just some mischief to serious crimes. And that's what I explore in my book, Corporatocracy. Now, for this presentation, for you, especially for you, given the call of the question, I wanted to ask myself, is my nightmare scenario actually happening right before our eyes? So let's look at what we can see in the 2024 election. So what have our nominees said about democracy? They've said very different things. So, for example, this is a statement from Kamala Harris when she's accepting her nomination at the DNC, and that is very different than statements from Trump, including that he'll be a dictator on day one. And then there's this really weird quote that he gives to a Christian audience that says, in 4 years, you won't have to vote again. It's an ambiguous statement, but it's not good. Anyway, there are ways we can have a whole discussion over lunch, like what did he really mean by that? And Trump has been making the rounds where he goes to various groups of billionaires and asks them for money. So one of his rounds was going to oil execs and asking them for money. And then after he had that meeting, he very anti-electric vehicle. So what have the tech giants been saying? Well, Peter Thiel wrote this really problematic essay for Cato back in 2009. And one of the statements in that piece, which I don't think he's ever disavowed, is, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. And Thiel has heavily invested in crypto this particular year. He was also the bankroller of J.D. Vance when he won his senatorial seat. And now, of course, Vance is the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party. Meanwhile, we have Elon Musk. Elon Musk has been using, formerly Twitter, as a disinformation and misinformation free-for-all. And some of the things that he spreads on X are disinformation and misinformation specifically about elections and elections administration. And people have also noted that his AI is also spewing out disinformation. So maybe that's not surprising given who trained it. The Winklevoss twins decided that they would give $2 million in Bitcoin to support Trump. I'm not sure if that's $2 million in real money or fake money. And Trump has been very public about embracing crypto, including saying that we should pay down the US debt using cryptocurrency. And this has been met with some derision, including Nell Minow, who's a corporate governance expert. She said, why not just pay with monopoly money? Yeah. And just this Monday, he and his son launched a new cryptocurrency exchange called World Liberty Financial. So let's follow the money for a moment. So I'm going to give you a taste of what it is like to do campaign finance. You have to stare at data like this. So I made this like unreadable on purpose. These are the 25 biggest donors to super PACs. So to make this a little bit more like legible, if you compress it, then you can see that most of the money is coming from Coinbase and Ripple. And so the biggest spenders in terms of super PAC donors are crypto, oil, Melinda Gates, tobacco, business consulting, and Ross Perot. Remember him? He's still around. Yeah. Well, his companies are still around. The money's still there. And if you can also look at this from the point of view of the super PACs themselves. So Elon Musk has a new super PAC called America PAC. On the record, they've raised 8 million, though the press says that they've actually raised 30 million. That's probably just a reporting lag, so we won't know how much they raise until the end of the election. Then we have Protect Progress. That's another all crypto. It's raised 19 million. Then there's another all crypto PAC called Defend American Jobs. That's raised 24 million. But the real gorilla is Fair Shake. Fair Shake has raised 200 million and has already spent 100 million in this election. Yeah. And I think it's an open question whether voters will care, because most voters don't own cryptocurrency or not in this market. But you guys might care as Ohio voters, because they are coming for your sitting senator. They have said that they are going to spend nearly $1 million a day between now and election trying to take out Sherrod Brown. And they're already gloating that they took out Katie Porter. And we don't know how this story will end. But I sort of predict that the 2024 election is going to go down as the crypto election. And the reason I write this book is I don't want the 2024 election to be the last election. Thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jacob Eisler of the Florida State University College of Law. Professor Eisler is the James Edmund and Margaret Elizabeth Hennessy Corey Professor of Law at FSU, where he teaches and researches in the areas of constitutional law and election law, with a focus on democratic process, theories of just representation, and anti-corruption. Professor Eisler is the co-editor of the Data-Driven Personalization in Markets, Politics, and Law from Cambridge University Press, which explores the emergent, pervasive phenomenon of algorithmic prediction of human preferences, responses, and likely behaviors in numerous social domains, including political micro-targeting. Previously, Professor Eisler was an associate professor of public law at Southampton Law School, a lecturer and Yates Glazebrook Fellow in law at the University of Cambridge, practiced law at Allen and Overy LLP. I have friends who would be very mad at me for mixing those two up. And Herman Smith LLP in London, England, and clerked for Judge Gerald E. Lynch on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Professor Eisler has a BA from Williams, a master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, a JD from Harvard Law, and a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Professor Eisler.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you, Atiba. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank everyone who's been involved with this symposium, particularly Andrew McGurty and the rest of the Law Review, who have been fantastic hosts. And thank you to Atiba, who has known me since I was a youngling in the legal academy, And if you ever want to know about some of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the book, my book that I'm going to discuss briefly, you can ask him. So I've got some good news and some bad news about it. Got some good news and some bad news about this presentation. The good news is I don't think I'm going to hit 18 minutes. And the other thing is I think I managed to fight PowerPoint enough. These are the Case Western colors, right? Yeah, huh? The bad news is we've been hearing about AI mayors and crypto bros, and because per Freud, I think knowledge comes from suffering, we're going to start with some passages from Ronald Dworkin's 1986 masterpiece on the nature of judicial decision-making, Law's Empire. And yes, I extracted these using the brilliant technique of snipping from Google Books. But I actually think these are two of the best little descriptions of how judges actually decide cases. What do? They take a sort of swath of previous information, previous doctrine, and they try to integrate it into a coherent whole, right? This is particularly what they do when they're deciding a hard case. It's an easy case, they might just be able to say, precedent, we can apply it. When they're doing a hard case, they often have to balance competing principles from differing precedents. But ultimately what they do is they take this previous information and they try to create something coherent out of it. Now, in case I struggle with returning to previous slides, I'd just like to point out, you know, there's an interesting line in the second passage about lawyers being philosophers, which is important because Dworkin thinks judges are more than just mechanics who paste cases together. He thinks they actually do something unique. But taking his description in a more simplified way, it sounds a little bit like what an AI might do. Now, I could stand up here and claim, like I claim I'm 6'2" on my online dating profile, stand up here and claim that I have a masterful technical understanding of how AI operates, as opposed to being like many a crypto bro, someone who just claims that and then tries to convince, I suppose in my case, a tenure committee to believe that I know what I'm talking about. But I think I have enough of an understanding to draw some surface level analogies between how AI models work and how Dworkin describes the lawmaking process. Because what do AI models do? Well, they essentially take inputs and assess weights, try to, there's essentially a process based on an artificial neuron that tries to determine if a certain stimulus is activated, right? In a way that remixes information from a large database, right? So in some ways, this AI process, particularly in the hidden layer, sounds a little bit like what we might think a judge does, right? And this raises, I think, an interesting question. Will AI be in a position to displace or significantly supplement the lawmaking process that we currently give to judges, and has been particularly important in the past few elections as judges have faced difficult decisions about how we should rule ourselves. And now we sort of get to the core topic of this symposium. What sort of resources can we turn to decide fair democratic self-governance, particularly when there are disputes over what fair democratic self-governance means? Traditionally, we turn to judges. I'd like to ask a sort of theoretical question. Could we ultimately turn to technology to perform this process for us, particularly if we think judges might be biased or politicized? That's a topic I'm happy to discuss in questions, but that's something that we see as a particular concern with the Supreme Court now. I am going to answer, and if we go deep into the weeds of this, my fancy word time, ontological priors are going to be exposed. But I think the answer here is no, right? How do AIs work? How do these models work? They work by taking inputs, pushing them through an algorithm, and then giving an output. The algorithmic operation is entirely a function of initial inputs. How do judges make decisions? Well, on a surface level reading of Dworkin's, I think, very helpful and very insightful description of what judges do, they take previous cases and treat them as inputs. But judges do something more than that. They engage in an act of moral synthesis that takes the information and uses it to extract a principle that reflects our core commitments as a society. Thus, when judges operate in an appropriate way, they produce something novel that tells us something about how we rule ourselves and the commitments we have as a society. And this is where Dworkin really shines. It says what judges should do is they should take these previous precedents and, while giving them appropriate weight, look to the values of a society and synthesize them to express the value of society that weighs and builds upon the formal expressions of those precedents. I don't think this is something that AI can do, right? AI is entirely input driven. It doesn't have that moral capacity to extract underlying principles. Now, I suppose there's an underlying supposition here that I don't really put in the presentation because it would take us really into the weeds, which is, unlike, I'm actually curious, does everyone here know the name Blake Lemoine? Anyone heard that name? If you want to have some fun, you can Google this. He was a Google engineer who a few years ago came out and announced that he thought that the Google AI was intelligent and had moral rights. If that's the case, I guess the AI police, the robot, the Terminator, are going to march me into robot prison, because right now my view is that I suspect that AI does not have this moral capacity. That's something that lies with persons. Why is that? My own view that I expressed in The Law of Freedom, if you're interested in this book, let me know. I wrote it, extremely painful. Poor Atiba had to read chunks of it and provided very, very, provided very helpful feedback. But I think this is because humans have a unique capacity to act freely, all right? I think ultimately this reflects our unique presence in the world that is not entirely physical, right? I'm enough of a skeptic to avoid using fraught words like soul, but there is some aspect of our identity that is somewhat mysterious. And that part of that mystery, that in fact I would say the core of that mystery, is the fact that we are free beings. AIs are deterministic or probabilistic. They are not free in the same way, at least as far as we can see now. They are a function of their inputs. Humans are not. We are morally autonomous beings, even if in this material world we can't fully grasp that. It is our inability to fully grasp that makes us free. And if I really wanted to torture you guys, I would start talking about Immanuel Kant's theory of the noumenal, but it's too early in the morning for that. All right, that's the principled position. I don't think that AI can displace the human capacity to make moral judgments about freedom, including and particularly in the judging process of synthesizing law to come up with theories of democratic freedom. How does this work in practice? It's a nice theoretical position, but are there any concrete examples that we can think of? Well, I tried to come up with a few. We'll see how effectively I can trace the high theory of freedom to these gritty doctrinal examples, but I think they at least show why it matters. And both of these examples are marked by the fact that what the right thing to do is a function of our moral judgments as autonomous actors, as opposed to something that can simply be extracted from previous decisions. And here's one that has, in a certain sense, it got the most attention in the 1990s, but it's still a live issue. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act requires, and by the way, because after Shelby County in 2013, this is the only federal statutory protection remaining that protects minority voters, because the pre-clearance requirement was nullified. I'm happy to answer questions about that. That just means more for you who are election law specialists. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is what is left. And the current requirement of it is informed by the Jingles test from the case from the 1980s called Thornburg v. Jingles. And it requires that majority-minority districts be created under certain conditions. And it's a three-part test that doesn't really matter too much, other than if there's a group of minority voters who might, in a state, who might be defeated as a bloc consistently by the majority, by the racial majority, the state is required by this federal statute to create majority-minority districts so that the minorities get some representation. And there's a question that the court has constantly debated. Should crossover districts receive Section 2 protection or be part of the Section 2 mandate? Crossover districts is where you might have an alliance between minority voters and the racial majority where they share political views. And right now, Section 2 districts do not include crossover districts. But, and this is where I'm going to draw it back to the question of how we construct democracy. This question can't be answered simply by looking at doctrinal inputs or even looking at statistics. There's an underlying question here. What do we want our democracy to look like? Are we most concerned with ensuring that minority voters have some voice given the threat of majoritarian oppression, or do we have as strong or even stronger an interest in trying to create allegiances? And there's a great passage from, I think it's Holder v. Hall, where the court says, look, in the longer run, we might want to move towards encouraging crossover districts to break down racial barriers in voting. But these are both, these are the question of the value of minority-majority districts and the value of crossover districts. These are classical examples of the types of things that might be the subjects of hard cases and require us to go to the fundamental democratic principles of what we want a free society to look like. AI, simply by remixing past precedents, can't answer that question for us. That comes to us as self-determining citizens to make a decision. Another example, partisan gerrymandering. I think we've heard enough depressing stuff from our first two presenters. Sorry, guys. So I won't go too much into the condition of partisan gerrymandering. But speaking more generally, it's been debated for 40 years. And there's been a real focus, particularly since Justice Kennedy decided to torture election law scholars by saying, well, maybe I'll allow partisan gerrymandering to be struck down by the federal courts if you guys can come up with a nice enough test. This led to a real focus on technical tests that could identify partisan gerrymandering. That sounds like potentially a great role for technology. Could technology, including potentially AI, and some of these tests really rely on AI construction of districts, could that inform if partisan gerrymandering should be illicit? But like in the Section 2 question, the question is not one of metrics or technical remixing, but what do we want our society to look like and how do we want to govern ourselves? Do we want parties to be hard-knuckled competitors who can use any mechanism available to gain an advantage? Or do we want parties to adhere to certain moral visions of collaboration and fair play? Like the question of if we should prefer majority-minority districts or crossover districts, the legal status of partisan gerrymandering is a question that we can only answer through moral decisions about self-governance. So what's the takeaway here, right? There are limits to both the threat and the promise of technology in informing democracy. The idea that the status of AI would be primal or fundamental in determining the status of democracy is I think tends not to be a true claim because it will always point back to more human questions about democratic fairness. Now, technology may of course play a secondary role in shaping these conditions, and I think what we saw in some of the first two presentations were how technology can have this effect. What was particularly interesting is in both presentations you saw the role of campaign finance and the way that campaign finance might be accelerated or exacerbated by technology. But I think campaign finance will always boil down to the dynamic between democratic equality and economic inequality that is the uncomfortable part of the liberal capitalist democratic détente. Technology may exacerbate that tendency, but the question will always be one about how to ensure human liberty both in the economic and political realms. But the fundamental nature of these debates will always exist beyond technology, and I think in a certain sense that should be a source of comfort for us because it means that so far at least, technology has not displaced the fundamental humanity that guides us in contemplating democratic process. And I think that is my last slide. Thank you very much.
Just taking a second.
Yes, you should.
Okay. All right. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Commissioner Dara Lindenbaum of the Federal Election Commission. Commissioner Lindenbaum was nominated to the Federal Election Commission by President Joe Biden in February 2022 and confirmed by the United States Senate in May 2022. She served as chair of the FEC in 2023, where she oversaw the petition for rulemaking to clarify whether fraudulent misrepresentation includes deliberately misleading campaign communications generated through the use of artificial intelligence. Recently, she spoke with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the Aspen Institute about the impact of artificial intelligence on the 2024 elections. Prior to her appointment to the FEC, Commissioner Lindenbaum was a partner at Sadler Reef, a boutique law firm in Washington, D.C., focusing on political law. There she advised candidates, political committees, and organizations on a wide range of laws and regulations, including complying with state and federal campaign finance and election laws. Before joining that firm, Commissioner Lindenbaum was an associate counsel in the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where she focused on election law and voting rights. She has a Bachelor's of Science from Northeastern University and a JD from George Washington University Law School. Commissioner Lindenbaum, thank you for joining us today.
Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay, thank you. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. We had a big week at the FEC with a lot of voting, and I have to be in town. It's a real honor to be on a panel with these professors who I follow and read and have these, really exciting ideas and thoughts on participation, campaign finance, election law, and everything, incorporated. Do y'all have my PowerPoint put up there? Are we sharing it?
Yeah, you can share, I think.
Okay. Remind myself how to do that. So it's been a little while since I think I need to look the authority to do that. There we go. Again.
We say it
Yeah,
right.
you're good.
All right, now let me see if I can get my notes so I can make some sense here today. All right, can't see my notes, right?
Correct.
But you can see my slide?
Correct. Yes.
I did it right. Wonderful. All right. So my presentation's a little bit, I think, different than everyone else. Is that mine's kind of the basics on what we're seeing, what's been going on, and kind of what I see moving forward. Let's see. Sorry, give me 1 second. there we go. All right. So I'm going to just go over, some of the use cases and what the FEC does and does not do, and really what's going on in the states and some other things that are happening there. So what are we seeing this year? Well, we're seeing a few different things that may or may not be a big deal, right? The biggest thing that really launched a lot of concerns from, I think, the general public was a robocall in January before the New Hampshire presidential primary that used a deepfake voice of President Biden, urging residents not to participate in the primary. And it came out really quickly as this had happened. I think a lot quicker than people would have expected. And there was, it became pretty easy to combat because it came out so quickly. The press was able to attack it, and the campaigns were able to fight against it. Also, because it was a robocall done to phone lines, it's pretty easy to track there, right? That's different than some of the place things happen on the internet. But it really brought about some of the big concerns that we're seeing from people. We are also seeing, some of these images that are, various forms of good or good not. We have the Grok 2 AI from X that is helping create these kinds of images that look very clearly fake. But those are these images in the cases that we're seeing, but they're getting better and better. And in these cases, people weren't really trying to make them look real and fly under the radar. But we can really start to see that, and that's kind of the concern. It's getting easier and easier and easier. Again, no, this isn't new. Photoshop has existed for a really long time, and people have been able to manipulate images. People, in 2010, we had a robocall issue with Governor Martin O'Malley's campaign, and there was a voice that went out that was made to sound like Michelle Obama's that told people, you don't need to go vote, it's okay, we won. Again, that didn't require AI, that was just a little bit of voice manipulation. So this isn't new, but what is new and what is particularly concerning is the way that misinformation and disinformation can spread through especially social media, and how this AI is really helping it spread there. So sometimes when we're talking about deepfakes, we're actually, well, in my opinion, missing the broader issue and the problem that's existed for a while now, and the lack of trust in information that we see, and where to find trusted sources. And it's just making the whole process worse. One of the biggest concerns that we are really seeing, and that I'm most concerned about, is the foreign interference aspect of this. We are seeing these different foreign actor linked operations like Spamouflage, which is the China linked influence operation. We are seeing this out of Iran. Different ways where it becomes really easy to exploit divisions that already exist in this country through these different measures. And just recently, the Secretary of State exposed a Russia-backed effort through RT to really sow division in Black communities by promoting this Russian-backed and quote-unquote news organization. It was really spreading this misinformation and acting like a trusted source. But it's also not all bad, and particularly as Professor Green said, there are some really exciting things that can come out of AI in elections. One of my favorite stories that have come out with it is an organization called Fair Count, which I used to represent. And they did a case study where they were using these AI tools to go through all of the information they collected when they were knocking on doors for people. And they were asking people about if they plan to vote, why or why not, and getting other information about what motivates them. And these kinds of narratives can be really hard to synthesize. It takes a lot of time and effort. But what they were able to do was use these AI models to transcribe voice memos and then feed those into an AI tool to really analyze what was motivating people in some of these small rural communities that aren't really reached. These are particularly communities that campaigns don't invest much time in because they don't see much bang for their buck. But because of these AI tools, they're able to reach these communities in a more powerful way without spending so much time there that they are missing some of the communities that have bigger vote totals to get out of. So there are very great ways that this is happening. Of course, it's not what we see most of the press about because that's not the exciting stuff in many people's minds. So let me tell you a little bit about the Federal Election Commission. We are the independent regulatory agency established to administer and enforce federal campaign finance laws. That is all we do. We are not an election administration agency. We don't deal with the actual voting in elections. We only deal with campaign finance. And the only other federal agency that deals with elections is the Election Assistance Commission, that really deals with the administration of elections and helping election officials and poll workers and certifying machines and giving out grants. So it always surprises people to know that there isn't a federal agency that really runs the way elections go. It doesn't make sure that people are doing things the right way, that isn't making sure that people are campaigning appropriately, that does not exist on the federal level. So it's pretty limited what the federal government can do here. So we have a very small area that we actually regulate on. And just a year ago, we received a petition for rulemaking asking us to really clarify the law on our fraudulent misrepresentation statute. Now, this is a little confusing, and it doesn't make all that much sense, but we have a statute that prohibits any candidate or their employer or agent from fraudulently misrepresenting themselves as speaking or writing or acting for or on behalf of any other candidate. Let me go to that slide. In a way that is damaging to the other candidate. So this is very narrow. Think this is one candidate, right? This isn't a super PAC. This isn't, a bad actor. This is a candidate fraudulently misrepresenting themselves as speaking or writing or acting on behalf of another candidate in a way that is damaging. It's a very narrow statute, and we were asked to somehow expand this so that it covers deepfakes, right? And that's been a challenge because the general public is concerned about deepfakes in elections, and there are many members of Congress that are very concerned about this. It's a bipartisan issue. But our statutory authority is very narrow, and it can be hard for us to sometimes make clear what we can and cannot do while explaining a pretty complicated statute. So what we've been working on for the last year is how do we deal with this petition for rulemaking, and how do we really give it the effort it needs and be respectful of the process, public, while staying true to what our mission is and our statutory authority. So we received over 2,400 comments during this rulemaking petition, and ever since then, we've been figuring out what to do. So yesterday, we actually had a very big vote on this. And working with 3 of my colleagues, so there were a team of 4 of us, a bipartisan team, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, we came up with a interpretive rule that I think clarified exactly as we were asked to do, that our fraudulent misrepresentation statute applies regardless of what kind of technology is being used. Mixed results from people. I will say that lightly. But what we were able to say and agree on is that regardless of what kind of technology somebody uses to engage in this fraudulent misrepresentation, it still violates the statute. We don't want to be in the business of rulemaking on specific kinds of technology, because then we become outdated in a year, right? I know what they're using right now, I don't know what they're going to be using in a year, and our statute really covers everything. It's the actual action, it's not the tools that are used to do that. So again, we didn't make everyone very happy, but what we really have done here is throw it back to Congress and tell Congress that if you want us to do more, you have to give us the authority. I think they should. I think that they should be following the states, which I'll talk about in a second, and possibly require that disclaimers be used on technology that uses deepfakes. There are other ways that they can regulate it around it that people are thinking. But right now, that's really in Congress's hands. Of the interpretive rule, what it does is it's technology neutral. So the really exciting stuff is actually happening in the States. It's been interesting to see some of the rhetoric coming out of Congress and some others in this space, because this really is a bipartisan issue. People on both sides of the aisle are very concerned about how they themselves are going to be portrayed. Anybody is minutes away from being, attacked in this manner or misrepresented in this manner. And so in the states, they've moved really quickly. States have taken a few different tacks here. So there are outright prohibitions with time limits, which is the way Texas does it. So, you cannot use this deepfake technology in certain ways, a certain amount of time before the election. There are constitutional issues there because unfortunately they didn't put in an escape clause for parodies, which is a really important constitutional provision. So we'll see kind of what happens there if they end up including that. But Texas is considered a very Republican state, and they were one of the first ones, out of the gate to pass this. We have issues with this. They have to disclose on the ads that it has this technology with time limits. So without time limits. So at any time, if you're using this technology in a certain manner on your ad, you have to say that you are using this generative AI. And then other places where you have disclosure with time limits, so within 60 days of an election, 90 days of an election. And that's one of the core First Amendment reserves that we've put in place in a number of different election-related things. So if you have certain ads within a certain window of time before an election, there are certain additional requirements, and that has kind of helped uphold things in the Supreme Court. And just some of what we're seeing here in Texas. So it's within 30 days of an election, you cannot do this kind of deep fake video. Florida, it's anything you in whole or in part with the use of generative AI. One of the interesting discussions around the disclosure idea is, what are we trying to accomplish here? So there are a couple of different ways of looking at it. If you have a deepfake video, right, Do we want to have it very clear on that video has generative AI, and that so the public knows that in this particular video, this is one you have to look out for. But the truth is, so much of what we see now is going to have generative AI in different ways to make the ad better, to make it more effective. You'll see it makes it cheaper if you want a candidate to be standing next to a waterfall. Instead of taking the candidate to the waterfall, you just put a waterfall in with the generative AI. Do we really need to disclaim that? Does it actually dilute the disclaimer? If we have a disclaimer that says this contains generative AI on anything that uses that technology, should we limit it just to those situations where it is used to against an opponent? Is that constitutional to do? Or do we want to keep these disclaimers on so that it can kind of remind everybody that you have to question everything you see? I don't know the answer to that. It's a question that I battle with, and in conversations with folks who are actually reading these laws, I raise, and I think that it's important for people to think about what are we trying to accomplish here and what is it going to actually do. The other thing is California, although California I think just passed their law, and my PowerPoint has not been updated since then because I have not had a minute to really see what they are doing, but I think it is going to be have a constitutional challenge very soon. So again, on the federal side, there are a number of different proposals, and these are all really bipartisan proposals. There are bills to prohibit the distribution of materially deceptive AI-generated audio and visual media that includes a candidate to influence an election or to solicit funds. And this is sponsored by Senator Klobuchar, Senator Hawley, Coons, Collins, and Bennett. This is a real bipartisan bill. We have AI Transparency in Elections Act, which would add disclaimer requirements, and that's again Senator Klobuchar with Senator Murkowski. And then also bills to help election administrators. Again, I don't see any of these passing this year, even though I think many members of Congress wish they would, but leadership for one reason or the other is not allowing this to move. But I can see the dam breaking next year. The other thing that I've said from the beginning of the year is that I think it depends on how much the candidates really bloody each other up here, and how they feel, especially the leaders in the parties, on what is them using generative AI here. I don't think we've seen that much of it, which has been interesting. I think in some ways we are slightly protected from some of the worst that can happen because of the expansion of early voting. So, in 2 decades ago, somebody could drop something really detrimental to a candidate 2-3 days before an election and see it absolutely explode with no time for the candidate to come back and combat it. But now people are, in Virginia, I think we started voting today. So there was this lead time that does, early voting does so many fantastic things, but one of them is decentralize the ability for somebody to really muck it all up. And one of the other things that's happening in the federal space is the Federal Communications Commission, for reasons that are beyond my understanding. Some of my colleagues have decided to get into fights with the FCC about their attempts to regulate in this space. And it's really my position, and I think it should be everyone's position, that this takes a whole of government and whole of society approach to attack this. Whoever has jurisdiction to do something in a constitutional way should really be thinking about this, and if they're not, they are shirking their duties. We all need to be thinking about this. And that leads me to kind of one of the really bigger points here. is about what regulating can and cannot do. We can't stop really bad actors. A campaign is going to put on a disclaimer if they're required to do so. A foreign government who is intending to get in the middle of our elections is going to do everything they can to go around and not put a disclaimer on that. A disclaimer is not going to stop them. They're going to find those other ways. We've seen the technology companies like OpenAI say that they have these safeguards in place. But those are the bigger companies. That's not the smaller companies who are using this technology and are able to bypass those safeguards. So this is a huge problem that we cannot regulate our way out of, and the law is not going to do that. We need everybody involved in here, from government, like the intelligence community, but also everybody in the community to find trusted actors, to find trusted source of information, to be able to combat that misinformation. A lot easier said than done, but it's one of those critical components because we use all of our tools here.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, for that presentation. And with apologies to my colleagues, I want to ask first how your time is, since you started your presentation with the fact that you're in the middle of rulemaking. I just wanted to be cognizant of how much time you have to be here with us, as opposed to needing to go.
We're done. We passed it yesterday.
Oh, okay.
You have me as long as you want.
Great, great, great. So the great news then is that we have about 36 minutes until our 11:15 break. So there's lots of time for questions. So I would encourage all of us to think about questions as we might have them. I did prepare some questions, and I see you, Professor Enton. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. Quick comment for Professor Torres-Spelcy and then a question for Professor Green. The reference to Nuremberg, our late colleague Henry King was the youngest Nuremberg prosecutor and spent many years on our faculty. So this is a good place for the reference. Professor Green, you referred to errors that AI introduces in various aspects of election administration, and that raises for me the question, how is the error rate for AI, how does that compare with the error rate for humans?
Oh boy. Well, I'm completely not qualified to answer that question. Let me just say first, but so I've been working with AI myself. So the election law program, this project I run that helps judges deciding election disputes, we're creating a 50-state election code tool that will help judges identify and contextualize state election codes. And the work to put this together has been pretty intense. And one of the things that we've had is students going through some of the material and figuring out whether, for example, a case is an election case or it involves, something not related to elections. And so we are starting to explore whether or not AI could help us do sort of a first pass. But one of the things that we've realized is that there's just an unacceptable error rate. So in other words, we couldn't deploy the AI tool and be done with it. That, in other words, it needs human review. And so I think AI in the election administration realm is useful in the same way, in that it can speed up processes, but that it can't be a substitute for human review. And so I think in some ways, I don't think election administrators, I think they understand and don't think that they would substitute AI for human review. But I can tell you, there have been studies of things like hand counting ballots and whether or not hand counts are more accurate than than using software to count ballots, and that data is clear that human error is far greater than a computer tabulated result. So I think it's a little bit apples and oranges because one is sort of an optical scan. There's not AI being used there. And the other example that I was talking about where you take large amounts of data and use AI to process it, I think it's clear that there's a large error rate in that second scenario and that human review is required. So just trying to kind of lay out a possible answer to that question.
So we have more questions. Let's start down here and then we can work our way back.
Hello? Is this on? Hello? So this is for Professor Eisler. You assume that judges have a moral bias, but I think you're talking about morality with the judges versus AI. Maybe I misunderstood. Moral. That they're moral. That the human morality plays into their decisions.
Well, it's more. So this is why I relied. This is why I relied on Dworkin. He believes that sound judging is inevitably moral because what judges do, so they may do it well, they may do it badly, they may assert principles that we find acceptable, and they assert principles that we find unacceptable. But judging is inevitably a moral practice. I wasn't saying that they necessarily make the right moral decisions in the sense of the right decisions or the ethical decisions, but rather that judges inevitably engage in a type of practice that is procedurally moral. And I think that's true, right? Because what judges are inevitably doing is not merely remixing previous information in the way that AI does. What they're doing is they're making a type of judgment that is distinctly moral, let's say distinct in my view, and I think in most understandings of jurisprudence, distinctly human. So you can't, in effect, dehumanize the process of judging. It's not, judges can, of course, do this badly, and we can point to, would often be called anti-canon precedents that we now see as morally wrongful, but the judges were still making a type of decision that was moral in making those judgments.
But I think you said that that's better than what AI could do.
It's not so much that it's better, it's that AI could never emulate that process, right? To give a crude example, the idea that we could replace judges for some decision, for judging, but also for any sort of election law process in a deep way, I think it misses the essence of it. There would still be a moral judgment underlying it, and if we tried to delegate that to AI, I think it would be the underlying human actor who decided to delegate to AI who would then be making that moral decision, right? That the idea that we could completely offload this to technology just isn't an accurate statement.
I guess I'm just confused by the use of morality when you think of greed or marital bliss or political bias when decisions are made.
Yes, sir, since you have the mic, and then we can go to you next.
State-of-the-art AI uses machine learning to change itself. So I'm wondering, this is a two-part question. First of all, given that AI can change itself, what standard should be held to, should a campaign be held to if the AI changes either its process or the outcome and the campaign says, I didn't intend that, or I didn't know it was going to happen, or because of black box technology hides their intentions? And the second part is, given the state of our rules of procedure and rules of evidence, they're not capable of finding the evidence that would answer this question. So what standard should a campaign be held to? Is it an absolute standard? Is it still an intentionality standard? And regardless of what the standard should be, do you think, given the status of our rules of procedure and evidence, that we could even prove any candidate to be held liable at this point?
That for the commissioner?
Well, we got 35 minutes left, right? So whomever.
Well, now 30. So.
I can offer some thoughts. So I thought a lot about this, and I think you pointed out exactly what the problem is with trying to regulate deep fakes. And I think that there's something to be said, and I'm really looking forward to our panels this afternoon to applying some kind of a defamation type model where you're assessing intent in a similar way that you do in a defamation claim. But you're right to point out that it's much more complicated when you're talking about a tool that can kind of create itself on its own. So I see huge problems there. And in the end, what I ended up deciding was that the only sort of constitutional and practical way to do this is to do just have notice requirements and just call it a day. But that's really not very satisfactory for reasons that the commissioner suggested, because foreign actors and anonymous actors online won't comply with that notice requirement anyway. So it's a very troubling problem, and I banged my head against the wall for months on that one, and I think a lot of other people are too. So it's in some ways an intractable problem, and I guess probably the commissioner can describe how intractable it has been to rulemaking.
I'll just add a general point about AI since we are at a law school. At best, ChatGPT is a B student. At worst, it is an F student. And what I mean by that is, so I teach 2 seminars, which are paper writing seminars, which require our students to actually cite real law in the real world. And it is so obvious when someone has used a computer to write their papers, because I actually check every site, and once you find like 2 or 3 fake sites in a paper, then you almost find that they're all fake, and then they get the F. And there have been lawyers who've been sanctioned for putting hallucinated citations into their briefs and putting them into court. That is not the way to start a law career. Do the research yourself.
I'll just briefly speak to the first question you asked, which is about machine models improving themselves. And this has been the subject of a lot of attention and anxiety in sort of the tech sector, the idea of superintelligence, AI models that could essentially become recursively smarter than humans. I shouldn't say skeptical isn't quite the right word. It's more that I'll believe it has a capacity for genuine creativity when I see it. I have no doubt that they're incredibly impressive capacities to do tasks, do tasks that we didn't expect computers to be able to do. Whether that will, and self-improvement might be one of those. Whether that would achieve genuine human creativity, I think is a really interesting kind of question about the nature of intelligence itself, right? If we look at what AI can do, take what it can do with images, which I think is even a more vivid, I presume everybody's seen the capacity of AIs to generate really striking images, now videos, but all it can do is reprocess what's already been done. It can't, in a word, it can be a hack. It can't be Andy Warhol. By the way, I'm not an Andy Warhol fan. But the point being, he did something conceptually different, right? And you're talking the ability of AI models to improve themselves, whether that exists in silos that are not genuinely creative, seems to be the question. And then if AIs ever start doing things that are genuinely creative, showing novel conceptual work, that will raise questions about if we are unique as intelligent actors. And I think until we have that point where we see AIs demonstrating what looks like genuine creativity, we can always trace responsibility back to the human actor who is employing it, or I shouldn't be so confident. We can be more comfortable tracing responsibility back to the human actor who is relying on the AI.
But the question of what creativity is it creative to hallucinate a citation? I mean, in some ways, that's very creative. It doesn't exist in the world.
Commissioner, did you want to weigh in on this particular question?
Sure, I think everyone just raised 10 different things that I was all thinking different comments on. But I think there's one idea of when we talk about the defamation standard and how that works, right? The important thing there is that it's not a government agency that is deciding if one defamed another, right? There's a whole court process, and it's either a judge or a jury who's making that determination. And when we break down, when people want agencies like mine to regulate in this area and decide if something is or are not defamatory, Is that actually something that should happen? Is that constitutional? Is that a good government practice? If it's not just the FEC that nobody has very high thoughts on, should DOJ be making those kinds of determinations and deciding if somebody should prosecute that? When you really think about that, I don't think the answer is yes there.
Professor Eisler, you are remarkably persuasive that these hard cases require the synthesis of moral ideals that is inaccessible to AI. Do you believe that easy cases, the ones that are not the subject of debates over moral ideals that manifest themselves in legal arguments and decisions, could these easy cases be outsourced to AI to relieve the busy attorney and overworked judge who invariably spend too much of their time on these more trivial matters?
So I think that would actually, that's a great question. I think there would actually be a real risk there in the following way. Underlying an easy case is always some deeper normative determination about what should be controlling, not necessarily as precedent, but as a type of meta rule, right? What should be the source of authority. And it's straight, there is always a moral judgment in what, this is when Dworkin says lawyers are always philosophers, that's the point he's making. It's not that they're always pointing to pure moral philosophy, that they're always making a moral judgment about what type of authority to rely on, what should be authoritative. I suppose that creating a pure procedural outsourcing process would be very dangerous because it would cut off a line for that creativity, even in an easy process. That said, I'm cynical enough to recognize that where there's a way to make money or improve efficiency, the system will squeeze that out. And I already see, I've already heard stories about lawyers using AI to help them write briefs. And I think the real question here, which I'm not sure I have a firm position on, is the degree to which we want to regulate the sausage making process, right? Do we simply want to look at the outputs and say, well, if there are if all the sites look good and it's been stitched together in a way that looks fit for purpose, should we care if chunks of it were generated with AI? It's also going to be a real question we face as educators. If don't know how effective they are. I don't think they were that effective in the first instance, but I presume they're improving, where you can take a piece of text, put it through an algorithm, and it'll tell you if parts of it were AI generated. If a paper that's otherwise fine, the student has taken it and polished it, checked each site, stitched it together, that they can say, well, but you used AI in the writing of this paper. Should that be necessarily a basis for disciplinary action? Or do you say, well, you produced something that is acceptable by those lights? I don't know, and I suspect ultimately, look, I'll try to avoid going too far off the rails here, but technology like this always has deeply disruptive effects for our current practices. The development of writing eliminated the tradition of the oral bard, for example, right? Will AI have that type of disruptive effect on what we consider our current idea of what writing consists of? I'm worried about that, and because I'm feeling a little bit like old dog, in my own way I approach stuff, old dog, new tricks, it will come with costs, but ultimately I don't think we'll be in a position to make a decision about that. The effect of the technology will have its own momentum.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to just take 30 seconds to interject as well. Professor Eisler made a very interesting point in terms of the dynamic and thinking specifically about the judiciary, right? Law clerks get hired for precisely that purpose, right? We outsource the researching and the drafting that feeds into the judge. And by the way, law students, clerking creates an opportunity for you to learn from that process. So there are policy reasons to think cautiously about making AI a judge's law clerk on top of the sort of epistemological and moral and other issues around creativity and composition. With that, I'll yield to the next question.
I just want to say, I think that's a great point, and I think one reliance on AI would have transformative, potentially pathological effects on how people think more generally, and that might be a reason to limit its use, particularly in the moral case of judging. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. One of the things that, as we're having this discussion about advanced technology, that worries me even more is that we have this at the same time as these diminishing in-person third spaces and this increase of civic engagement and democratic messaging and organizing happening online, whether that's in social media or otherwise. How do you, we've kind of skirted around this, but how do you suggest not having a spiraling effect in working to combat these incredibly well-resourced anti-democratic forces who are either directly controlling or through advertising and other ways controlling media streams where people are actively attempting to do this organizing work in a way that we're not spiraling, increasingly taking away the kind of democratic backbone of our society and where most of that energy is coming from? That's for the group.
Yeah, so one of the things that makes this really, really difficult and fraught is the First Amendment and the Supreme Court's approach to the First Amendment. And one of the cases that I really do loathe, though I think pure free speech advocates love, is a case called Alvarez. It is also known as the stolen valor case. And so you have this lying liar who lies, named Xavier Alvarez. And one of the things he lies about is having military honors that he didn't earn. And that violated the Stolen Valor Act. And so he's actually prosecuted for lying about his stolen valor. And his lawyers, I think rightly so, said, okay, there's a First Amendment issue here. And when it's resolved at the Supreme Court, they essentially say you have a First Amendment right to lie about your own biography if you're not making money on it. It's sort of like, it's different if you're defrauding someone, but if you are just lying about yourself, which is what he was doing, they said you can't go after him criminally, even if you're lying about something really serious like military service. And that, I think, is what, if you tried to go after X or Elon Musk for all of the nonsense that he has generated, lying about elections, lying about election administration, I think his first line of defense, like the first line in the brief, would be citing to Alvarez and saying, like, I can lie about this stuff. I'm not asking anyone for money. Go ahead. And it would be very interesting to see what the Supreme Court would do with that.
Yeah, I would just add, I'm equally troubled by Alvarez because I think it rests on the assumption that the marketplace of ideas will fix this problem. In other words, someone will lie about their military service and you can just look it up and figure out whether that's a lie or not. But I think our marketplace of ideas is fundamentally broken. And it is sometimes virtually impossible for somebody to use the marketplace of ideas to fix the problem because of some of the hydraulics that panelists have been talking about today. And I'm assuming that we're going to hear a lot more about Alvarez this afternoon and from First Amendment scholars who are addressing it. But I do wonder how long it will take the court to figure out that the marketplace of ideas is dysfunctional.
To take it in a slightly different direction, I think the risks that are being posed by technology are in one sense not especially new, and I think you can trace it. Bob Putnam wrote a book in 2000 called Bowling Alone about how American society is becoming fragmented and individuals are participating less in civic organizations, right? The title comes from people used to go to, civic organizations, whether it be the church or the Masons or the Rotary Club. Now they kind of sit in their own apartment and watch Netflix, right? I think technology is exacerbating this trend. The ultimate path, I think, to chart out is very difficult because I think you're seeing in very subtle demographic ways how technology is displacing standard modes of civic engagement. And I think this is where I think the threats of technology often are more pervasive and subtle than we see. It's not just people being exposed to false information, it's people turning to technology to fulfill social and existential needs in a way that they used to civically engage with each other. The problem is that's a very hard thing to regulate back, right? In a way, it's a bit like, AI, we could say, is an expression of this. Technology, evolutionary forces broadly construed will have their own momentum. So I don't have a clear answer for you. History tends to sort out itself.
I actually want to pick up on this theme of, yes, this is new and there are risks and threats, and yet at the same time, to quote the ancient wisdom of there's nothing new under the sun. And in that sense, I want to turn to the commissioner for a second and ask one of the questions that I had while listening to your presentation, which was in your initial list of things that you mentioned were going on in 2024, you mentioned robocalls. And that got me thinking about, well, you know, misinformation and disinformation about elections. The robocall is a classic. And, you know, there was litigation from the 70s and 80s about robocalls and, in essence, voter intimidation. Would you care, and especially given your practice experience in this area, would you, give us a little bit on what other the longer arc about election disinformation, prior to this sort of 2020s crisis of AI?
Thank you. I like this question, although I hate the actions that people take in the misinformation space. I guess this has been going on for as long as there have been elections. And I wasn't, since the beginning days, but, in studying how people have tried to prevent other people from voting or convince people not to vote for another person, people have done some really disgusting things. And some of the things that one of the things that most motivated me to get into this space was even, hearing about people leafleting doors that say that Republicans vote on Tuesdays and Democrats vote on Wednesdays, or telling people, especially targeted at, it's always been targeted at Black and brown communities, and seeing that now. If we think now at the ability we have to go online and quickly check something out, different than a long time ago when people didn't have the internet, or even the internet at their fingertips, didn't know who to call, maybe didn't have a phone, didn't have any way to really verify information or reason to believe that somebody was providing them with this wrong information. And you can really see that swaying things. We've also seen that these kinds of tactics and tricks often happens in really small communities. And it's the origination of micro-targeting, where if it's only targeted at 30 households, maybe other people don't find out about it and it can't be crushed, but it is hitting those 30 households that the disseminator of this information knows they don't want voting, and they are going to suppress their votes there. So all of this is just these, kind of horrific ways that people have tried to stop other people from voting, have been around forever. I think there was an arc at some point where people did have some of the tools to try to disprove themselves some of that information. And there are so many organizations like the Voters Committee, which I used to work for, who are really out there trying to help voters make sense of the information they're receiving about this, the actual voting. So there may have been, a period where people could kind of find trusted sources and they had their local newspapers that they could rely on. But now we've kind of flipped to the other side of it, where we don't have those local news anymore that people can rely on, or that local radio that is really big in some communities that can really quickly get out there and say, you may have heard this, it's flat out wrong, you vote on Tuesday. And now we're in that world where, how do you find that trusted information? There's this incredible organization called unexplored, that has been around for about a year, and is specifically designed to identify and fight misinformation spread in the Black communities. And the things that they discover, how many, sometimes from the very people or organizations that people are pushing people to get that good information, is flipping into misinformation or coming from these foreign sources. So it is such a hard world we're in, where is anything actually right? What we see is that wrong. The other side of it now is that we have what some are calling the liar's dividend, right? So you have, a a elected official who's not a good dude, and who, when he gets caught on tape saying something, it's like, oh, that wasn't me, that was, misinformation or AI. And we are seeing people use it that way. So it's this, I don't want to say a nightmare scenario, but it's a pretty crappy scenario where people don't know what's true and where to find that truth. And always feel like somebody's tricking them, which leads people to not want to go to participate.
So I would just add to that, one of the things that I spent the past 4 years thinking about is why do so many of my fellow Americans believe the 2020 election was stolen? Like if you poll, and it's a question that's actually polled repeatedly. The independents don't think it was stolen. The Democrats definitely think it wasn't stolen. A majority of Republicans to this day still think it was stolen. And we have to challenge ourselves to make that phenomenon go away, because that, I think, is ultimately deeply eroding of the democratic process.
Can I just jump in on that?
Sure.
I was actually listening to something about that recently, and for many of those people, they may not have thought it was stolen three years ago, but because of the information push that's been happening, they've actually changed their mind to think it's stolen. And that's even worst part of it all.
It's like the propagation of a meme of fraud. That's a shout out to myself, by the way. Yes, sir.
Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay. As a Republican activist, and since 1964, Republicans have cherished the idea that we can't lose an honest election. I think there was a good deal of, more than a good deal of truth to that in 1960. However, Republicans are still campaigning against Mayor Daley and Boss Tweed. It's a fixation. Mr. Trump has only spoken to a long-standing fixation among the Republican base, which I personally consider it self-defeating because it encourages us not to do the heavy lifting of persuading independents and marginal Democrats to think about voting our way. I actually know people who believe that Mr. Trump won the popular vote in 2016, and that he would have carried California except for all the illegal immigrants that were bused to polling places. Now, in my older incarnation, I do pro bono work largely in the Latino community, but also among former Vietnamese immigrants. And I find it a hard thing to get new citizens to bother to vote. The idea that you're getting people who are ducking the immigration, ducking ICE, getting them to go and vote fraudulently is appealing only to people who really want to believe it. I'm not sure I completely understand why it has that appeal. And so help me, in 1964, when not only the polls but the economy showed that Barry Goldwater did not have the proverbial snowball's chance, not just because of his own positions, but because there'd been an assassination and the economy was going great. There were people who insisted that they believed that the Democrats were going to set it up so that martial law could be brought in and there wouldn't be an election. I don't know how much magical thinking prevails among Democrats, but this was well before AI.
So reactions from the panel? I mean, yes.
So I'm going to go to give a sort of Thomas Piketty-esque response. So democracy, speaking very cynically, requires two things. It requires ideological commitment from enough of the constituency to sustain it, and it requires people to have an incentive to participate. I think one of the great untold stories in declining levels of trust is that is the underlying lack of incentives for people to engage with society. What one might call the golden age of American democracy, starting with the sort of the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, was also a period of enormous economic opportunity in America and high levels of social mobility. One of the questions that I'm starting to think about more and more is the degree to which declining levels of electoral trust actually reflect declining levels of social mobility, right? And the fact that the opportunities that were present in the sort of post-World War II era for many individuals to advance in society without necessarily feeling like they were participating in a completely ruthless zero-sum game is lost, and this is undermining democratic trust. I think the problem is, one, it's very difficult for electoral procedure to fix that, right? And two, I think that's the type of optically unappealing truth that politicians don't want to recognize. They want to pin the blame on a more concrete actor. I think this is why you get things like attacks on immigrants or claims of electoral fraud. Those are more concrete than recognizing that our society might be losing some of the social mobility that was really appealing feature for 30 years.
Where to begin? Can we solve all of democracy's problems in 3 minutes? No, we're not. It's why people write full books about these topics. It is the Gordian knot of a problem. How do we make elections both trusted and trustworthy? I think we have to figure this out, and we have to figure it out very quickly and almost in real time, because voting in some states starts in a couple of weeks. And I want voters to go to the polls feeling confident that their vote is going to count and matter, and that the will of the people will determine our next president, our next control of the Senate, the control of the House, several governor's races, many local elections. There's so many reasons to show up and vote. In my home state of Florida, we have, do we want to legalize weed on the ballot? And do we want to give women back their bodily autonomy? The stakes could not be higher. And I need voters to actually show up and vote so that public will and sentiment is actually translated into policy at some point.
And if I can just maybe add that, if you're worried about elections and the degree to which they're trustworthy, the best thing you can do is go and be part of them. So go and be an observer for the party that you most agree with. Go and work at the polls. And, every time I've confronted, and this is just anecdotal, anybody who is really doubtful that, people are being bussed into, non-citizens are being bussed in to vote, or, election officials are hiding or destroying votes or whatever. If you go and watch an election, first of all, it's like watching paint dry. Nothing happens. It's very, orderly, which I was, at the Fulton County elections observing in 2022, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that that's the case. And secondly, that you'll find that election officials are doing their best. They are like us. They are citizens who are stepping forward to help administer elections. It's an incredibly difficult and complex process. And I think the more you get involved, if you distrust elections, the more you'll see that everybody's trying to do their best, and that there are a ton of safeguards in place to make sure that voting is safe and reliable and secure. So I encourage people to get involved, not just by voting, but also by taking part in the election process.
I was going to ask a question, but in many ways, I think you've answered it. So I might pose a question sort of to the room based on what I think we've heard, to do a little bit of synthesis and piggyback on this last question. What I feel like I'm hearing from all four of you is that technology has incredible positive potential in some ways and incredible negative potential in others. Unsurprisingly, that's been the nature of technology since technology has existed. But in particular, that there are specific things that artificial intelligence technology is really good at. It's really good at information gathering, it's really good at information synthesis, and it's really good at least some forms of information presentation. And then there are other things that it's really bad at. It's really bad at transparency. It's really bad at provenance. And it's really bad at what I'm going to call moral serendipity. So thinking about that, our answer to a lot of problems as lawyers and law professors is law, is regulation. To the extent this is a question for anybody, I think it's a question for Commissioner Lindenbaum. Is there an extent to which law just isn't an answer here? Right? Is the very nature of what AI is doing eroding trust in a system in a way that law can't or shouldn't intervene?
That's sometimes where I come down to try to think of, if we were given all the power in the world, like if the FEC was given all the power in the world to regulate ads, is that a good thing? I don't know. Wouldn't that, having government bureaucrats be able to determine what is true and what is false, is that a good idea? I don't think so. I may think I'm pretty good at it, but I don't want some of my colleagues making that determination, or future commissioners making that determination. And if that's my answer, then I don't think that's a great idea. And if we're just relying on this in this space, we are, maybe some element of that needs to go that way, but there's so much more of it. It's a whole society issue.
I would add, some things can be fixed by law. And for example, one of the sources of dark money in our elections is our statutes were last revised when broadcast ads were the thing. It was the way that you communicated with a vast electorate. That is no longer the case. So sadly, when we put in the definition of electioneering communications into BICRA, we specifically said it was a broadcast ad. And so what BICRA captures, the sham issue ads, which is a good thing, I think, it doesn't capture them if you put it in a Twitter feed, or if you put it in a Facebook feed, or another place online, because that's not broadcast. So you could have a Congress that cared about such things, and they could change that definition and broaden it so that it doesn't just hinge on whether it came over a TV antenna.
I think that's a good place to leave everything. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists, and particularly thank you, Commissioner. And I'll yield back to Mr. McGurty.
I don't have much to say, but I wanted to recognize Professor Ellis and give him a round of applause for being the moderator for this. We'll be back in 15 minutes at 11:30 for the keynote from Professor Citron. There are still refreshments out in the back, coffee, tea, water, and then bathrooms are back in that corner. See everyone in 15 minutes.